I also think people will lie to themselves about their priorities, right? They'll
Very true.
say, "Yeah, I'm in it. I'm really like this is what I care about," and then they'll go on vacation with their friends to Mexico for a week, when they really should have been focusing on writing their business plan or whatever.
Well,
Like I think what people say and all that matters. Just look at what people do.
yeah.
Just look at what people do. There's so much like talk about, especially now, like everyone like there's all these like fake Instagram like entrepreneurs, and as a general rule of thumb, if someone's taking a picture of themselves like next to an expensive car, they're not a legitimate entrepreneur. They should be taking a picture of themselves next to like a shitty beat up Honda,
Yeah.
and then I'll believe that they're actually an entrepreneur.
All right, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to Nick Carrier's Best You podcast. I'm super fired up today to have the one and only Will Nitze with me today. Will, I want to start off by just saying thanks so much for taking some time out of your ski trip to join me today.
No problem. Happy to do it.
Yeah, man. So, Will is the founder and CEO at IQBAR, and over the past 2.5 years, he scaled his brain food bar and brand from $0 to $4 million from zero institutional funding, which is super impressive, and I know he's just going to continue to build it more and more. But kind of the way I want to start today, Will, is that you kind of got really fascinated with the brain and how it functions and everything like that back when you were studying psychology back at Harvard. And then you went into kind of a software job from what I understand to your first job out of college. And then kind of in your mid-20s, you started to experience some of your own problems. You had like daily headaches and other kind of problems like that. And you sought to figure out, okay, what is going on with me right now? And you're kind of took a deep dive into figuring out what that was. How did you figure out what the root of your problem was?
Well, it was pretty painfully apparent, quite literally. I mean, so I just as you get, and not to say being in your mid-20s is old or anything, but just as you get older and you get into more of a sedentary lifestyle, and you're out of college where you're running around and you're not sitting at a desk for whatever it is, 12 hours a day, and you're pounding 3-4 cups of coffee a day. Stuff just starts happening, physically, and you start if you're taking the wrong route, you start feeling it quite obviously. So in my mid-20s, I just started feeling physically terrible, and I was always kind of chasing that next stimulant, coffee, namely, and to keep me going. And but I just crashed at the end of every day, and I was having headaches. And at first, I was like, "Is this just the way it is? Like when you're in a sedentary job and you're working all the time?" But I knew it couldn't. It didn't have to be that way. So that started getting the wheels turning for me in terms of how do I fix myself, and then sort of segued into, well, okay, is there a solution I can create for? Because I know everyone. I mean, it's an infinitely relatable issue to some extent.
Gotcha. So that kind of led you to start tinkering around a little bit in your kitchen, kind of figuring out, okay, there's not really a ready to eat product for me right now that's out there that I feel like is going to kind of help solve my issue. And so you kind of started playing around in the kitchen. And when did it kind of turn from tinkering around in the kitchen and like a hobby, and then like, okay, this is actually a business that I want to create?
Well, I knew I wanted to do something. I wanted to start something and set out on my own in some way. I just didn't really know how to do that or in what area to do that. So, it's just started with my whole life. I've been thinking about these kind of fun hypotheses of projects or businesses, many of which are just not possible because I don't have the know-how, or I would need to find a coder or whatever it is. I would always run up against some sort of barrier. But in this case, on the nutrition front, it's an incredibly difficult path to success, but the very first stages are relatively straightforward. They just require a ton of work. So I knew this was something I could do myself, and I could just kind of figure it out. But so and to even rewind a little bit, you start with a hypothesis, right? Like with any business concept. And so I said, I have this personal problem. I actually then basically solved it and physiologically experienced what a solution actually means and feels like by changing my diet completely from high carb to more of a paleo / low carb diet. And then started sort of these ideas started percolating in my mind about, okay, I fixed it, but I don't, it's not a perfect fix. Like, how can I create a ready to eat fix? And if I could do that, how big of an opportunity would that be? Again, there was no doubt that this was an infinitely relatable problem that needs solving. It was just a question of, could I create something that would be a good solution for this? So, when it really turned into from ideation to reality was, the first step I took was I called every food entrepreneur and boss, and I sat down with them for a coffee and just asked them a laundry list of questions. Just stuff that, the number one question of startups everyone says is, well, I don't know where to start. Where do you start? So that my goal was to solve that question. And so I asked them, where did you start? How did you manufacture? Where did you source ingredients? What sort of cost of goods should I be expecting? Blah, 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 blah. And that gave them an initial roadmap. And then once I had the roadmap, and I actually could see a path to this thing existing and scaling up and all that, then it became really apparent to me that this could work. Because, a lot of people have a lot of ideas, and unless you have that initial roadmap and you believe it can exist, you're not going to put in the hundreds and thousands of hours necessary to even just get to the starting block.
Gotcha. Yeah. So I think that's an awesome step to be able to sit down with a bunch of food entrepreneurs. And so once you kind of gained clarity on the roadmap, if you will, and you kind of answered the question to how do you start, what was kind of that first step? Was it like trying to nail down like that first prototype? Because I know you ran a Kickstarter with a prototype product. Was that kind of the first thing that was like, okay, I'm going to jump off from here?
Yeah, well, I mean, so there are stages, and there's an order of operations that, generally speaking, people try to follow. But people follow orders of operations in different sequences. So, my general sequence was, I had this idea. A prototype is the first step, but your first prototype is never a real prototype. So in my instance, I went to the grocery store and bought a bunch of ingredients and just mashed them together. And that was my quote unquote prototype. Of course, that's nothing like what could be feasible in the market. Can't scale it up that way. The cost of goods are way too high, but at least it's a place to start. And then you sort of lay out, well, okay, could this be feasible to scale up? And at some point you connect with the manufacturer and they tell you, no, there's no way that would work. Like, this is going to spoil, and this is going to create other cost issues, and we don't allow this ingredient in our facility, and blah, blah, blah. So you're kind of parallel pathing, at least as a first timer who doesn't really know how this works. You're kind of parallel pathing like a prototype as well as what could possibly be manufactured at scale. And it's just like brute iteration. You're sort of solving for things one after another. Like when I started, I wanted to include these crazy ingredients like curcumin or resveratrol, because they're good for the brain for a number of reasons, but there's just no possible way you can include them. It's going to make your bars orange or taste terrible or cost $6 instead of $2. So you just kind of like solve each of those incremental issues one by one by one by one, and eventually you get to a place where you're like, okay, this is pretty good. It's not perfect, even your first scale, even my experience, even the first mass production product, and I say mass production, we're talking a couple tens of thousands of units, which at that point was a ton. At this point is tiny, but even that's not going to be right. You're going to run into problems there. And so if there's one word that describes the startup process in food and bev, it's just iteration in my experience.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, I think I've learned how you've done like so many different tweaks to the product, to the packaging and stuff like that. And I kind of want to get to there in just a second, but to give everybody a little bit more kind of insight, like I mentioned in the beginning, how it's a brain food brand. And that's kind of one of the biggest things about it. And that was one of the biggest reasons you created to solve your own problem. And so a lot of people don't really think about the connection between what you eat and how it affects your brain. And so give the simplistic approach to as like what maybe why you have certain things in your bar and why it actually is good for your brain.
Sure. So that comes to that centers on the question of fundamentally what are you as a product, right? Because you have to decide any product or creator of a product has to decide what is the product, meaning what category is it in, how do consumers perceive it. So for any functional product, for some products it's obvious, like Reese's Pieces is a candy. For functional products, it's less obvious because it could be a medicine on that end of the spectrum. It could be a little less intense. It could be a nutraceutical. A little less intense, it could be a super functional food product. And then on the far other end of the spectrum, it could just be a food. It could just be a snack. And so you have to decide who are you existentially as a product. And what we decided we wanted, that you can reach a mass market in any of those categories. It's just a very different mechanism by which you reach that mass market. So for us, we picked, mainstream. We want to be a functional food. We want to be able to sell in Target and Costco and Sam's Club and all that. And that has serious implications, right? You're not making major claims like if you take this, that will happen. And so our goal is let's be the more brain healthy version of an RX bar or a Quest bar or whatever. But we want to play in those same categories. So one of the quick sort of heuristics for what category are you in is what are people buying instead of you, or vice versa.
Yeah.
That helps you understand. Okay, well, I want to. If someone wasn't buying us, they buy Quest bar. Okay, well then you're in the functional high protein bar category. You're not and you're in that set in that grocery store and yada yada yada. So, but to get more specific, what we include 6 brain nutrients in each product. So that ranges from everything from omega-3s, which everyone knows about. It's a really common, popular compound, to more sort of esoteric compounds like lion's mane, which is a functional mushroom and is becoming more popular. But it's, if you ask someone in the middle of the U.S. at a Walmart what lion's mane is, the odds of them knowing the answer is next to nothing. So, that's its own balance. But we include a whole host of 6 brain nutrients in every product. But again, it's new. They all have a scientific backing that they're good for your brain for XYZ reason. Right. We're very careful not to live in that medicine or nutraceutical world and say, if you take this, that will happen, because you get yourself into a lot of hot water. And you also have to keep reminding yourself of who you are. You're a protein bar that sells for $2.09 a bar, right? You're not trying to solve ailments, so to speak.
Yeah. No, I heard you on another podcast talk about how it's really hard to make those sorts of claims, because when you eat something healthy, you don't get the good outcome right away, right? It's not like, oh, I eat this and now I feel 10 times better. And the example you mentioned in that podcast was how like coffee is one of like the only things that you kind of get that direct feedback right after having it. And so it's really hard to like tell your customers, to present to your customers that we're this kind of bar. Like if you eat it, you're gonna feel this result, because you might get that result, but you don't necessarily feel it, and you don't feel it right away. So I think that's a really important kind of distinction that you guys make.
Yeah, I mean, it's a question of, you don't want to set yourself up for failure is really the question that you're trying to solve for. So don't overpromise and under-deliver, I guess, is another way of saying that. Like if
Right.
you're like, this is why the most wildly successful products in food and beverage have a feedback loop. You know, people don't go to Starbucks because it just tastes really good, right? They go because they get that physiological response, and it's a really strong response, and it allows them to do things quicker and be more alert and blah, blah, blah. You know, people drink Red Bull for the same reason, people, you know, et cetera, et cetera. But if you're not delivering that same feedback loop, well, you have don't promise people you will, because they're just going to be upset. So, and it's very form factor specific. So if you're making a bar, people expect very different things from your product than if you're making a drink or if you're making a powder. So you have to meet customers where they are. Meet customers at the expectation sets that they're going into your category with.
Yeah, no, I like that a lot. So you started from, right, like you said, no institutional funding, just you kind of in your kitchen tinkering around a little bit. And then I'm not sure how many employees you have now, but you have some obviously some employees right now, right?
Yeah, we're 6 people now.
Okay.
We'll be at, call it 9 at the end of Q1, I think.
Okay, gotcha. So what was kind of like one of the biggest challenges for you personally when you hired your first employee, or your first couple employees? Because I know that, you know, when you start something on your own, you're the one who gets everything done. You're the one who knows that if something has to get done, then I'm going to be the one to do it. What was kind of the biggest challenge in hiring your first and second employees, if you will?
Yeah, well, the first challenge is money. You got to pay them something.
Yeah.
So you have to solve for that first, because nothing happens without cash. So, and you had asked earlier about Kickstarter. So a good sort of way to solve the chicken or egg problem, namely the issue of, I don't have money to pay people to produce sales, but I also don't have the sales to raise the money in the first place, right? That's like the classic chicken or egg problem with any entrepreneur. Now you can solve that through crowdfunding, which allows you to sell a phantom product, and but to generate very, very real sales. You know, you get taxed on Kickstarter sales as if they're sales, and they are sales because they're pre-orders of products. So that was the first, step I took, is to run a crowdfunding campaign, generate sales, raise money on the back end of that, because you've de-risked the venture to a huge degree. If you're successful, this is all pending success. But if you are successful, raise money on the back end. Now you can pay people. That's like step one. Unless you get this, unless you have let's say you have 2 co-founders, it's a totally different way of going about it. You're all on this mission together. You're all not paying each other, paying yourselves, and you have a small enough team, but the team can cover everything, finance, marketing, sales, product development, etc. But as a single founder, you of course can't. You can sort of do all that, but you're just spread way too thin. So you need cash. So we generated the cash through Kickstarter, raised money on the back end, and the first hire, I think people make, in my opinion, your first hire has to be, well, it depends on what you're doing, right? If you want to complement your own skill sets in a totally non-overlapping fashion, right? So if you're going to be the product development guy or the sales guy, which I was, well, now you need an ops/finance person, right? Or you could be the ops/finance person and hire for other skill sets. But you're working backwards from what you bring to the table. So in my case, it was, I needed an ops finance guy, because I was just spending way too much time on ticky-tacky, getting on the phone with someone to order flax seeds, and it takes 2 hours a day, and it's not feasible to do that. So the first hire was ops, and then after that, I think people take different hiring paths and trajectories. So and it's never like perfect. I mean, I've had to hire and let people go, and along the way, and there would, again, you have some cash, but you don't have infinite cash. So you have to be a good storyteller to any new, incoming people that they're joining this, journey, right? But it's going to be a bumpy journey, and they probably have no past experience with a journey like that. So they're like, whoa, this is going to be way different from that desk job I was at, a month ago. And so it's just a very bumpy, rocky road. But generally speaking, I think you just have to map out what are all the functions I need to solve for, how much cash do I have to solve for those, and those will never map perfectly. You'll always be a little short, right? So then the question becomes, can one person double up on functionalities, or can I pay that person half and they'll do it because of XYZ reason or whatever. It's always messy, but that's kind of like the high level framework.
Yeah. No, and I think one of the most important things that you said is when you're hiring, you want to lay out the expectation with the people that you're hiring that, like, look, this is going to be a bumpy road because, like you said, so many people haven't experienced something like that before. So when one thing goes wrong, instead of them like freaking out, like realize like that's what's going to actually happen. And I think laying out that expectation is important. But one thing I kind of want to go back on it and ask you is, was there ever a point, so like you had this other job and so you started doing this, did you know like when you quit your other job that you're like, I am doing this thing long term, no matter what, no plan B? Like, what did that kind of thinking in your head look like?
Well, that gets into a topic that I think a lot about, which is really, I think everything boils down to risk and risk tolerance. And I think people perceive risk the entirely wrong way. Most people, I would say. So most people think about risk of like in the terms of, could I fail? That's how most people think about it, just in the shorthand. And they totally discount the risk of, will I be happy? Will I be fulfilled? Will I regret not doing this? All of those things, right? They totally discount those things. And instead they're like, well, what if my paycheck runs out? Or blah, 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 blah. And so I think they not only think about it in the, because let's say, like, again, nothing against accountants. Accountants are great. I would find being an accountant pretty boring, right? But let's say I was good at accounting. And let's say I got a job at some accounting firm, right? And so the risk of me ditching that career to go be a, whatever, a guitar player, is very high in some regards, right? I'm going to have to sacrifice a lot of cash because I'm not going to get a salary, and it might take me 3-4 years to work my way back up and being a guitar player, and I might have to give lessons on the side and blah, 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 right? That's risky in those senses. But what about the risk of being like miserable for the next 50 to 60 years? To me, that's the riskiest thing of all. And so I think there's that sort of imbalance between perceived risk and actual risk. And then the second thing is, when you're young, again, sometimes you may have a mountain of student loans sitting on your head. You may have, you may have to take care of your 2 younger siblings and you need cash to do that or whatever. But I think generally speaking, when you're in your mid-20s, the risk is just so low of doing anything because, God willing, you're healthy. You have the basic ability to earn cash somehow. You're not going to starve. And so what's the risk? I just don't understand what the risk is, especially today. I mean, in the 80s or 70s or 80s, entrepreneurship was not a cool thing to do, right? It was, you were kind of like seen as a weirdo, and now they're like a rock star, right? So there's some cultural element to it. So I mean, we're right now like, you're it's cool if you start a startup and fail. It's
Yeah.
whatever, you struck out on your own. Everyone views you as being brave, and so I just don't understand what the risk is. So that was how I saw it. I mean, it was like, okay, the downside is basically zero. You lose a little bit of time, but even if you crash and burn, you learn just an insane amount. So any quote unquote failure is going to set you up for better if you care about earnings, better long-term earnings potential in the future anyway. So that was how I thought about it. Now, I think a lot of people perceive that as like, oh, great, quit your job and do this crazy thing. It's not at all what I think you should do. I think keep your job, and again, it all comes down to life priorities. So you have an insane amount of time, even if you work long hours at night and on weekends, and you have years that you can use those to build something. Now, you may not view that as a better use of time than going to bars with your friends or hanging out in the park tossing the frisbee. Well, in that case, don't be an entrepreneur. But um, you have so much time. Don't force a solution. Get yourself to the point where you've created something, you can sort of market test it, and then you're ready to go. And at that point, quit your job. So it's just, don't be an idiot. Don't throw yourself in the deep end unnecessarily or prematurely. At some point, it's always going to be throwing yourself in the deep end, but do everything you can to de-risk, test, confirm, and then you're going to get to a point where you're just like, I gotta go full time on this, or I'm going to lose this opportunity. And once you reach that breaking point, you can't do it anymore, then do it. And again, that comes back to risk mitigation and risk management.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think there's a lot in there that was awesome, and I want to break down a couple of the things. I think when you first said, I think a lot of people look at risk the wrong way. I was like, I'm really intrigued about what he's gonna get ready to say here, and I absolutely love how you said how like so many people, they think about just like the negative thing, and they only think about a few categories. Like they think about what am I going to lose. They don't think about they don't think about what they could gain, and they don't think about the risk of the thing that they have not yet acquired. And that right there is a huge mindset shift. And I think the couple of categories that everybody thinks about right away is like, for risk is like, am I going to have less money? Am I going to be able to pay for this, pay for that? But they don't think about, am I going to be miserable over the next 20 or 30 years? And I think that most people, because I've done this too, because I've sometimes like early on, I've been thinking about like, am I going to have enough money to do this? Am I going to have money to do that? And like, I'm thinking like, I could so easily find a way to just get that money if I really needed it. And so like, get your head on straight, gain a little bit of perspective on what you're actually risking. Like you said, especially when you're in your 20s, like if you don't have kids yet, maybe if you're not in a relationship, if you're healthy, then your sole responsibility is you. And so like that makes it a lot easier to take on maybe a little bit more risk, if you will.
Yeah, I think, and I don't want to downplay the sacrifices you have to make, because they're large.
No
They're
doubt.
large. So you have to be ready for that. Like, you basically have to have no friends, or totally ignore your friends, right? You have to face a lot of relationship strain if you're in a relationship. You have to cut down your living expenses to as close to zero as possible. Like, I moved in with one of my friends from college's parents, who I had never met up until the moment I sat down for dinner with them, and I said, hey, can I live with you for a year? And very graciously, they let me. right? And there's like all these crazy, and that was awkward in many ways. And but you have to be okay pushing all of your ego, your self-importance, your personal relationships. You do have to be able to push all of those away. I think 99% of people are not willing to do that.
Yeah, well, I mean, as you said, it all comes down to what your priorities are in life, and it's like if you are not willing to prioritize maybe like your long term potential wealth gain, or prioritizing like creating something of your own, or prioritizing whatever it is, and you're more only willing to prioritize like having a lot of free time and spending a lot of time with friends and stuff, then maybe it's not for you, and that's fine. But you have to have the honest conversation with themselves, and I don't think a lot of people necessarily sit down and really think about what my priorities are, because but once you have that honest conversation with yourself, then you can determine that whether or not this is like actually risky in the areas that I care about it being risky, if that makes sense.
Totally. I also think people will lie to themselves about their priorities, right? They'll
Very
say,
true.
yeah, I'm in it. I'm really like, this is what I care about. And then they'll go on vacation with their friends to, Mexico for a week, when they really should have been focusing on writing their business plan or whatever.
Well,
like, I think what people say, and all that matters, just look at what people do.
yeah.
Just look at what people do. There's so much like talk about, especially now, like everyone like there's all these like fake Instagram like entrepreneurs, and as a general rule of thumb, if someone's taking a picture of themselves like next to an expensive car, they're not a legitimate entrepreneur. They should be taking a picture of themselves next to like a shitty beat up Honda.
Yeah.
and then I'll believe that they're actually an entrepreneur.
Yeah, no doubt. I didn't even realize until like probably a few months ago when somebody told me that like people actually do that. Like they rent out cars or jets to take pictures in front of. I was like, what? I was like, you got to be kidding me.
It's like, it's appealing to the lowest common denominator, right? It's like such a lazy, like, oh, money equals you must have made that money equals you started a company to make that money. It's like, it's the most basic, it's like slapstick humor kind of territory.
Yeah.
But kind of touching on one thing that you said a second ago was, I think a lot of people lie to themselves about their priorities, and I think what a lot of people end up doing is they take on the priorities of other people because they're not confident enough in sticking with their own priority. Because, like, for example, let's say if somebody has a group of friends who wants to go on a fun trip, and they get invited to go to the trip, and they really know they need to stay home and do work and get some stuff done, but instead they end up saying, yeah, I'm going to go and convince themselves it's going to be fun. Like, I need to spend time with friends, all this stuff. And then they end up going and they get back and they're mad at themselves because they kind of took on the priority of somebody else rather than staying true and confident in what was their own true priority.
I think you have to like rip the Band-Aid off. Honestly,
What do you mean?
You have to be like, if you really truly want to start something, and this all differs. It's all contextual. It's a little bit different for everyone, right? So
Right.
let's say you go raise a bunch of money, and you can hire 10 people right out the gate. Well, this is way less true for that guy or that gal than it is, let's say, in my instance, because you can pay yourself a good salary and you have all these people and you can delegate right out the gate, and you've almost created a small company right out the gate, and you don't have to eat ramen noodles 5 times a week, right? That's also a startup. It's just a very different startup. So but let's push that aside for a second. Let's say you're the kind of bootstrappy type, and I think this maps more like that first instance is probably more like tech, Silicon Valley type set up. And let's say in my instance, you're creating a consumer good, right? Which you're going to fetch a way lower multiple. And there's a whole host of reasons why you would want to try and bootstrap it as much as possible. But let's just say you are. I think at that point when you say, okay, I'm going to do this, you have to let everyone around you know, guys, like I'm going to be kind of out of pocket for the next maybe 5 years. I'm going to be probably a pretty bad friend. I'm going to be not that responsive. If there's a trip planned, I might cancel it, or I might not just not go at the last minute. I'm not going to be able to go out to bars with you because I'm saving money. I think you just have to set expectations with everyone around you up front and for yourself.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you just kind of start leaning back into that life you used to live, and it just doesn't work. It just won't work. I've seen it crash and burn so many times, and people just give up. So save yourself that heartache. I mean, if you're not going to really rip the Band-Aid off and do it, why bother in the first place?
Yeah, no doubt.
Well, I could go on about that stuff all day. I want to kind of go back to a story that I found interesting that I think I read about from you. And there was a point early on where you accepted a big order from CVS, I think it was, and you weren't sure necessarily how you were going to be able to fulfill all the orders yet. You just knew, oh, I'm doing this, I'm going for it, I'm saying yes. And then you kind of figured out where you were going to get all the production from, and then the production started, and the wrappers weren't fully sealing. And I want you to kind of just rehash that story a little bit for everybody, because I think it's really important, and it kind of reveals a couple of good lessons in there.
Yeah, I mean, every consumer packaged good founder or what executive or someone who's worked in a CPG company has their war stories. Whenever you're making anything, stuff will go wrong, just as like a rule of thumb. But and oftentimes the opportunity doesn't line up with your ability to fulfill the opportunity. And so you have to, that was the case in this instance where CVS said, okay, I'd like to put you in all these stores and make a couple 100,000 units. And so that was this big opportunity. Now we weren't at the place where we could really, really confidently say, yes, I can fulfill that tomorrow. Instead, we were, at this tiny contract manufacturer that couldn't do it. And so basically what we did, for better or worse, is we said, yes, we can do that. And then figured out how to do it. So what I mean by that is we changed to a new contract manufacturer. We, figured out how to make the unit economics work. We scaled up everything about the business in like a 1 month span, which is just nuts. And when you do that, there's a decent chance something will go wrong, because you by definition are doing it hastily. So anyway, to get more specific about the story, we drove out to the manufacturer on day one of the CVS production, and we're all fired up, and the whole team piles into my car, and we drive out and stay at this crappy motel, and we drive there in the morning, and it starts at 5 a.m. They start producing products at an insanely early hour. So we get there at 5 a.m. It's pitch black. It's icy. This is in the winter. We fishtail the car a couple times, and finally we pull into the parking lot of this contract manufacturer. We get in, sign in, put our hair nets on, and walk onto the floor. And it's incredibly cool to see anything be mass produced, let alone your own thing. But so, there's a couple stages with making bars. You mix it, and then you put it on what's called a slab line, and then it rolls out into basically a sheet of dough, and then it gets sliced into these what's called strings, and then there's this guillotine chopper, and it chops it. Anyway, everything was going great. we made it past the mix stage, and then it was forming well, and it was slicing well, and then it went into these wrappers. There's a machine called a flow wrapper, and so each bar goes in, and it's a crazy clip. It's like 200 a minute, and so we check out the wrappers. It looks great. They're in the boxes. Looks great. We're high-fiving again, chest bumping, and then this lady comes up to me and taps me on the shoulder and says, "Yeah, we have a problem." And I was like, "What do you mean we have a problem?" And she said, "Well, your wrappers aren't passing the blow test." And I was like, "Well, what's the blow test?" She said, "Well, we put bars in this pressurized compartment, and if they don't sort of pop up like a balloon, it means there's a leak. They're not sealing properly, and none of your bars are sealing properly." And I was like, "Okay, well, what do you do about that?" She's like, "Well, there's actually not really anything you can do about that. We can try and put the wrapper clamper to a higher pressure." And so we try that. Nothing changes. Meanwhile, the rep from the wrapper company went there that day. He was on the floor. So this guy started freaking out. And I start freaking out at this guy. I'm like, what the hell? They make millions of wrappers a year. You can't make wrappers that seal properly. And so we just sit there and like, oh my God, what do we do? Are we going to make hundreds of thousands of bars that don't have sealed wrappers? Of course not. So we stop the production. We're just like, stop. Everyone just stop. And we stopped it. And we had to throw out a good amount of product. And we were like, okay, well, we have to fulfill this PO. So we get on the horn with like every wrapper company in America. We're like, look, there's this crazy situation. We need wrappers in like a week. Because they said they could fit us in again in a week. Like, look, we need wrappers in a week. Like, please. And finally, we get someone who's like, okay, I think I could turn it around in a week and expedite them to you. So we did it. And we were back there next week and produced again, and the wrapper sealed, and the rest is history. So, but that's like, that's one story. I could tell you 3 others like that.
Yeah.
But
oh my Lord, I can only imagine. I would love to hear them. What do you feel like is? I think my biggest takeaway from that is that it's okay to say yes before you feel ready, because even when something goes wrong, you're going to find a way to correct it if you're, resilient enough and work hard enough. Now, I don't know if that's your main takeaway or main lesson, but that's what I first thought about when I heard that story the first time.
Well, I think it comes down to what kind of a business do you want to build, right? So if you want to build this like really, really fast growing business that's doubling every year, and you're a multi-million-dollar business in year 2, and you're going to have just epic screw ups. There's just no way to do that cleanly.
Right.
Now you don't have to do that. You could also build a business where you just say no to CBS, and you kind of work your way up. And okay, now I feel comfortable producing 50,000 units, and now I feel comfortable producing 100,000. But it's going to take you twice as long, maybe 3 times, maybe 4 times as long, right? So there's no free lunch, right? Like there's no shortcut. Either you go too fast and deal with the repercussions and figure it out, or you go slow, which is you don't deal with the repercussions, but you're just going slow, right? Now, yeah. I'm not interested in going slow. So I don't think there's one just like silver bullet concept there. Like I think It's preferential, and I bet 10 other people could tell you that story, and it put them out of business. So I don't think the answer is just like go do stuff quickly, no matter what. I think the answer is probably somewhere in between. It's like get yourself to a point where you're above some degree of confidence that you can do this thing at a high scale, and even if the worst thing happens, you'll still survive and you'll be okay. But it could also be this incredibly good situation.
Gotcha.
So it's preference.
Yeah, no, I like that. I thought what you said in regards to depends what kind of company you want to be. And it depends kind of like a lot of people don't handle stress very well. So if you don't handle stress very well, probably don't jump into something that you don't have figured out yet. Now, again, there's somewhere in between for almost every single person. But down to the last couple questions here. Well, I think that in order to get closer to the best version of yourself, that it's really important to try to gain clarity on what the best version of yourself looks like. What is the best version of myself capable of? And my goal every single day is to try to reverse engineer that best version of myself into reality. And so a question that I found really important for me to kind of think on is what I'm getting ready to present to you is there a specific skill or a specific piece of knowledge that the best version of yourself has that you don't yet currently have?
Oh man, that's a good one. Because I think there are things. There's a vector, and you can be at your early stage or your ramped up stage on any personality trait. And generally speaking, I think I have the traits necessary to be really successful. And the best me, they're not super ramped up. So I guess I'll give you one that I work on, and I think I could be a lot better at. I'll give you a couple. The first one is the ability to, the only way to really scale anything is to delegate and be a good manager. And I find that to be incredibly tough because you're never going to have enough time to be a really good manager. And then even with the time you do have, you can always do it better. And that's some mix of interpersonal skills, motivational skills. It's something I struggle with because I'm very much an inward focused person. Like, okay, if I could just do this, and this, that outcome will happen. And inherently, when you work with other people, you don't know what's happening in their mind. You don't know necessarily what makes them tick. You know generally how skillful they are at whatever set of skills, but you don't know exactly. And so you're moving into the unknown there, but you have to. You just have to. So, hiring and managing, and I guess team building would be the umbrella there, is something I'm always trying to learn more, because there's no one answer, right?
Right.
If Steve Jobs, right, who's an asshole, but creates this incredible empire, and then you have, someone else on the other end of the spectrum who's the nicest guy ever, and they build this epic empire. So it's not so simple. Don't let anyone ever tell you that one way is the best self way. Like I think there's a couple different ways to skin the cat here, but for me, that's what comes to mind, number one. And the second thing is humility. Like if you ever think that you're the man or the woman, you're not. Like you're just not. You're maybe a little better than you were, but I think like you have to have a minuscule ego to survive in this game, because when you start thinking you're the man and acting like you're the man, people start expecting you to be invincible, and you're not, and they start expecting you to not make mistakes, and you will. So humility, like never think you have all the answers, because I guarantee you don't. But you should always work towards having the right answers. Just don't act like it.
Yeah.
Don't act like you.
I love that. I love it. Well, before I ask the last question, well, I want to acknowledge you first. I think those last two things were awesome: the team building thing and the humility thing. But second, it seems like you're so deliberate behind a lot of the kind of really from a lot of the answers you gave. You almost, you talked a lot about the looking at risk differently, and you talked about specifically how you actually are supposed to look at risk, and you just seem very intentional behind the decisions that you make and the words that you say, and I think that's something that is definitely super admirable, and I love the story to be able to have the manufacturing screw up and then figure out within a week how you're going to be able to rebound and figure that out. So awesome stuff. But before I ask, Yeah, dude, of course. Well, before I ask the last question, I want to make sure everybody goes and supports you guys further. If they don't follow you guys and support you yet, you can find them on social media at Eat IQBAR, and their website is www.eatiqbar.com. Is there any other best place that people should go and learn more about the bar and get the bar? Awesome. Good deal. Well, last question, Will, is I think that getting closer to the best version of yourself is a constant journey. And I think it's also a unique journey. You touched on how you always need to be humble. You always want to learn more, today than you knew yesterday. And it's also a journey that is unique. I think that the way that I'm going to get closer to the best version of myself is going to be a little bit different than the way that you get closer to the best version of yourself. So for you personally, if there are 3 things that you can currently do or 3 things that you can currently work on to get closer to that best Will Nitze that you could possibly be, what are those 3 things that you can do or currently work on?
That's also another good question. Dovetails with the earlier question.
Yeah.
If there's 3 things, let's see, I would say psychological self-management, right? Know what makes you bummed out and what makes you fired up, and trick yourself into being always fired up, right? You know what your triggers, both positive and negative, are. Surround yourself with things and experiences that will generate good outcomes. That would be the first thing. Second thing which again dovetails with my earlier comment, surround yourself with the right people, right? Build a network both internally on your team, but also externally through investors, advisors, mentors, friends, whatever. Build the right group of people around you, because we are the 5 closest people to us, or whatever that saying is. So that's incredibly important. And then just keep going. I think it's so cliched and simple, but perseverance, just in its simplest, most raw form, is the most important thing in life, honestly. I believe, like, just showing up every day will produce incredible results. People start faltering when they stop showing up. So just show up, no matter how smart you are, how whatever you are. If you just keep showing up, good things will happen. I think it's pretty rare where someone just kept showing up and they didn't eventually achieve success.
Yeah, I love it. I love it, dude. 3 great things. That's all we got today. I appreciate it, Will.
All righty. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, dude.